Welcome back, everybody, to our studies of metaphysics. We're continuing our examination of ontology. This is the first topic within the broader conversation around metaphysics that we're going to be examining. The previous lesson took an introduction to the subject of ontology, looked at essentially what ontology was, as well as some of the ways in which we can classify different types of ontologies. This lesson is going to introduce arguably the most important of the metaphysicians or philosophers who have spoke on and written about the concept of ontology. This is, of course, Quine. Now, we're going to take quite a lot of time and do quite a few lessons looking at Quinean ontology and looking at the ways in which Quinean metaphysics essentially solidifies one of the most standard and traditional views of ontology within the general metaphysical inquiries. So we're going to take an introduction to Quine in this lesson, talk a little bit about his paper on what there is, and then also talk a little bit in future lessons about his ideas and his processes by which he comes to what he describes as, quote, ontological commitments. And this involves things like paraphrase methods, as well as looking at the ability for you to regiment statements in first order logic, for example. All of these things we'll explore in future lessons. So, like I said, the previous lesson took an introduction to the subject of ontology, as well as a basic overview of the study of ontology, what ontology essentially is and involves. And like I said, here again, we are going to talk in this lesson about one of the most important contributors to the study of ontology, that being the work of Quine. So, if we remember back to our previous lesson, the study of ontology is at the most fundamental level the study of what there is, what we can be committed to, what kind of ontological commitments we can have in terms of their existence, what there is. According to philosopher Loux, ontology is defined as the study of what there is, as well as a particular theory about what types of entities there are. Now, these are two different things. You might think that these are relatively synonymous in terms of the questions that we're asking, but in reality, they're not, because on the one hand, the study of what there is a relatively broad and all-encompassing question, but the study of trying to theorize and develop a particular theory about what types of entities exist is far more limiting in terms of being able to have ontological commitments. Because if you come to the conclusion, for example, that there is no such thing as abstract entities, it is only concrete ideas that exist, or concrete objects that exist, then you are developing a theory about the types of entities that there are, and you are automatically rejecting the existence of a number of entities that other people might accept. When we talk about the study of what there is, we're talking a little bit more about developing theories to systematically analyze our commitment to the existence of a particular thing. So it is often a subject that takes the form of philosophical questions about what kind of entities exist, what kind of things can exist, what do and what don't exist. And this is really the fundamental foundational bedrock of metaphysics, because when we study metaphysics, we are going to have to study, firstly, the nature of reality. And one of the things that is part of the nature of reality is the things that fill reality, the things that reality encompasses. So the kinds of objects that exist in reality, like the pencil that I'm holding in my hand, for example. Now, the question of whether or not we can be committed to the existence of these things is a question of ontology. Now, speaking more about Quine, bringing Quine into this conversation, W.V.O. Quine was a philosopher who lived, should I say. That sounds a little bit more sterile to say who existed. He was a philosopher who lived between 1908 and the year 2000, so he died quite a few years ago, a good 20 or so years ago, and most of the modern philosophy on the question of ontology derives out of the work of Quine and his Quinean ontological commitments. And so as a result of which, it would be easy to say that he is arguably one of the most important philosophers in not just the area of ontology, but also in other areas of metaphysics, as well as the philosophy of language, which we're going to get to in future lessons as a separate series in and of themselves. So as a result of which he was not only a philosopher, he was not only a metaphysician, he was not only a philosopher of language, he was also a logician as well. He made and developed a lot of issues relating to modal logic, for example, which we will get to in future lessons time as well. I understand that I'm saying we'll get to in future lessons time, but ultimately when we talk about philosophy, there are so many different areas of philosophy that different philosophers can work in, that means that essentially we have to develop our own set of lessons in all of these different areas as well. So he is credited with new theories of language in terms of the philosophy of language. He is credited with new theories in metaphysics, new theories in ontology, so a sort of substrata of metaphysics, and also new theories within formal logic. And so on this topic specifically, he would develop a method for addressing ontological questions. And so this Quinean method is what is known today and seen today as the modern standard for metaphysics and ontology. You can't study ontology in any great detail without coming across the Quinean method for establishing ontological commitments, which is why I'm going to spend not only this lesson, but also spend a lot of other lessons in the future talking about Quinean methodologies for ontological commitments. Not just talking about them from an acceptance perspective, so not just talking about them with the view that they are automatically true, but also talking about them from a critical perspective, looking at some of the ways in which the Quinean methods and the various aspects and elements of the Quinean methods may or may not have certain values attached to them, if that all makes sense. The views on ontology that he presented himself came from a paper that he wrote in 1948. This was a paper titled On What There Is. And in On What There Is, Quine looks to answer two main philosophical considerations. And it is these two main philosophical considerations that are going to take us into our understanding of metaphysics in the future. He begins by arguing that many philosophers before him have been misled when it comes to issues relating to ontology. This is why we conclude in a lot of instances, for example, that the Quinean method and Quine's ontological commitments theories are seen to be the modern standard because they are so revolutionary, or at least at the time they were so revolutionary compared to that of philosophers prior. He will then go on to develop what he believes to be the correct method to decide what entities one ought to have an ontological commitment to, i.e. what kinds of things one ought to believe in. And by believe in, we mean essentially come to the conclusion that they exist. And we'll get to that in future lessons' time.